I was looking at a picture of a little child, the son of friends of mine. People post on Facebook. I go on Facebook periodically to catch up with all my children friends whose parents assiduously put their darling pictures on there. This particular little child is one that I'm at a distance from his parents. We're not even really close friends, but this child has always interested me. I have to say, the beginning of his life, he looked like E.T. for quite a long time, in a charming sort of way, and I just wondered if he would ever grow out of that. He's now grown out of that. But it was fascinating to me just to see his photograph. And of course, you know, this is a subjective impression I'm going to give you. But he seemed like such an intelligent child. He's maybe 2 now. But I kept coming back and looking at his picture, and am I imagining that? Or is there really, you know, some uniquely aware kind of energy? When you sort of isolated his little face outside of the fact that you could see that he was a child and just looked at the eyes, they just had this, well, the word I used was intelligence, but it was a refined intelligence. Just very thoughtful, very thoughtfully looking out at the world. Now, I'm sure if I discussed it with his parents, they would tell me he has many other dimensions to his nature, because little ones do. That's just the way it is. But at the same time, our souls are not created at birth. Swami Kriyananda's extremely succinct and very compelling statement about the relationship of parents to their children was this. He said, the parents, through the physicality of gestation and birth, create the physical vehicle through which the soul is able to express its destiny. But the parents create neither the soul nor its destiny. And it's a very beautiful relationship of service and gratitude and service that works itself out in the most wonderful way when one just looks at it in the abstract. But every child brings with him or her the entirety of their karma. There's nothing, they're not a blank slate. I was intrigued once to hear the mother of twins talk about the great difficulty that she struggled with for many years, because the moment her twins were born, one of them was an old friend and one of them was an old enemy. Master said, love, of course, is a compelling force that draws us together, but so is antipathy, and so is hatred, because hatred becomes an obsessive preoccupation, and that excessive preoccupation creates a powerful vritti, and that powerful vritti can draw you together again. Reincarnation, when I had this conversation with the individual involved, reincarnation was a very comforting thing to hear, because otherwise you can imagine what kind of a complex could get established in the mind. So we're all working on these very, very long rhythms, and age, as Swami once said, is the most trivial definition of the soul on its long journey. It has to be taken into account, age and gender and culture and all of these things, but they're trivial when you look at it in the long sphere. It's self-evident, looking back over the life that I've lived, that this was not my first experience, my first lifetime on the spiritual path, not my first lifetime with Swami Kriyananda, with Master, with the whole story. I was talking to some of our graduates from our K through 8 school, often use their vacation days to come back and visit the old homestead and kind of hang out with the good old people who here, Helen, Gary, and all the other teachers who have been so important to them. And so two of the graduates were here recently, and I was just chatting to them about high school and what they were doing. And I just commented that I never enjoyed high school at all because I was so bewildered. I could never figure out what those people were doing. I just couldn't figure out what their values were and what was important to them. It was just totally confusing to me. I remember when I was 13, And of course, that's a very tenuous age. 13 and 14 were the most difficult years I had. By 15, I'd sort of found my people a little bit and was doing a little better. Beatniks were just starting, and hippies were kind of like waiting in the wings, and a kind of alternative culture was just beginning. And even though I wasn't solidly a part of it, I could smell it on the wind, and I could tell that you could be eccentric, and it was all right. But I remember when I was 13, and I was a skinny little undeveloped girl at a time when such things were becoming rather important. And all of my friends were rather voluptuous for their age, and therefore far more popular than I. And I remember one of those basement parties. You all remember those basement parties where somebody's playing records and you're not being asked to dance if you were me. And I remember sitting against the wall in the dark, just somewhere between laughter and despair over the whole thing. Things are very tumultuous at that age. And I didn't know how else to put it. And it wasn't even egoic. It was just a fact. I knew I was just different. I have to add, I was still in El Paso, Texas at that point, which added another layer to the whole thing. El Paso has become a more advanced civilization since then. But at the time, it was not, shall we simply say. And I remember just sitting there being intensely aware of the fact that I was from another planet. And I just didn't know how to relate. And something happened which I don't think was a serious temptation, but maybe it was. It was like an angel and a devil came and spoke to me as I sat in that dark basement, being the epitome of wallflower, because I was like pasted up against the wall. And it was like God said to me, I could make you popular. But in order to do so, basically I would have to take away a lot of who you are. And I said, no, thank you. I don't think I want that. Now, it was too easy a temptation to resist, to really take seriously, but nonetheless, I have very few meaningful experiences from my whole childhood. But that was one of them. Isn't that interesting? And then also, when I was very small enough to be able to fit in half of the floor of the back seat of the car, in the ages which some of you remember before seat belts, when children could just scramble all over the back seat of an automobile. And my brother, who was very clever and really knew how to get my goat, who was older than I, teased me in such a way that we ended up having a spat in the back seat. And my mother, who was a very attentive and good mother, divided the blame equally between us, which I thought was really unfair, and scolded us severely from the front seat, and my feelings were hurt. I must have been 2. And so I crawled down onto the floor, as children do, and curled up in a little ball, put my head against the floor of the car so I could hear the rumble of the wheels, which is a very soothing sound. Many parents spend a lot of their children's babyhood driving around because it'll put the kids to sleep. And I remember very consciously thinking, the outside of me is upset, but if I keep going deeper and deeper into myself, I will find the part of me that is untouched by this experience. Now, those are very sophisticated words, but I remember in whatever I thought, however I thought as being 2 years old, I remember that's precisely what I did. And I found that part of me that was untouched. And that was how I calmed myself down and sort of got over the whole experience. So it's no surprise that when I was 18 and somebody handed me a book about yoga, about the spiritual path, about self-realization, that told me that my consciousness was inside and my consciousness was entirely under my control and my consciousness was bliss. I'm sure this isn't exactly how it happened, but how I remember it is I read a paragraph and said, yeah, this is it, and that was the end of the story. And in truth, that is how I lived from that point on. Just before my 19th birthday, I never had another interest. It took me a little time, till I was 24, to finally move to Ananda, but I never wavered from that point to this point in what I was doing. Now, in our reading today, in the part about autobiography, from Autobiography of a Yogi. There's so many, I mean, Swami says some of the most glorious language in all of spiritual literature, and then he quotes these 2 paragraphs, and these in the autobiography are the chapter where Sri Yukteswar, Master's guru, touches him on the chest and puts him into a state of cosmic consciousness. The way, for the poetic license, for the sake of the story, Master acts as if this was all new to him, and it was this great experience that he'd never had before. He alters the story a little bit to make it work, but it also wasn't untrue, because that is precisely how it happened between himself and his guru. Now, one of the most beautiful and powerful definitions of God, and in fact, in 2003, Swamiji wrote a manifesto, you might say. He put down on paper what we believe as self-realizationists of Ananda. The way of the Ananda Sanghi, he called it, the one who belongs to the Sangha. And there were many parts to that, but included in it was a multi-point, I can't remember now exactly, 7 or 10 points of what we believe, what defines us as Ananda self-realizationists. And it begins as we believe in an all-pervasive Satchit Ananda. And that Satchit Ananda is the best, in my point of view, non-English word for the very unspecific word God that we use all the time. Sat Chid Ananda means ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss. I mean, now, isn't that a marvelous definition of God? If we're wanting to think, what is it that we seek? What is it that we want to experience? What do we want to become one with? What do we want to manifest? I've stood here in front of you at different times and talked about the peculiarity of my little brain and this the inescapability of consciousness, and how that weirds me out in a big way a lot of the time. And I have to just hold myself from the edge of flipping out, which I believe I have done in previous incarnations. People have incarnational patterns, and mine has been to just drift off into some asylum and just talk to beings that aren't there, just to get out, try to escape from the inescapability of consciousness. And the fact of reincarnation, which is good news for some, is also really bad news for others, because there it is. Even death is not going to take it away from us. And sooner or later, we must deal with our lives entirely and only on the level of consciousness. And, I was coming to that when I was younger, but I was very nervous because nobody was helping me with that, which is why I seized upon self-realization as soon as it came. They were helping me with everything but that. That's a little bit unfair, because my parents were very ethical and very moral and very attentive, so they were helping me to become a good person. And that, of course, is the first step toward having the right consciousness, is to have the right behavior and the right attitudes. But the real problem of consciousness was unanswerable. I remember another friend of mine, and he, about the age of 6, he started asking his parents about death. And his parents couldn't answer him because they themselves were nervous about death. And he immediately sensed that even his parents didn't know. And it put him, and they thought, they tried to reassure him by telling him it's going to be a long time before you die, you have years and years of your life. And as he tells the story as an adult, they couldn't understand that it wasn't a factor of time. It was the fact of having consciousness end that was just totally, he just didn't know what to do with himself. They sent him to a psychiatrist, and he didn't resolve it either until he got on the path of self-realization and realized, oh, consciousness doesn't end. Now, for him, that was good news. For me, it's bad news at times, unless we understand that ever-existing, ever-consciousness, ever-conscious, is ever-new bliss. And that word ever-new, it's just really quite remarkable, isn't it? Because we move around this world, and it's ever-new all the time, isn't it? We all came in here at 10 o'clock, and everybody, we're all different now. It's just completely changed. We're that much closer to the grave. We're that much farther away from our birth. We've digested our breakfast and are thinking about our lunch. Just all of these things are happening. Maybe you've already had an argument with somebody sitting close to you, and you're feeling a little bad, or you remembered something else, or you've thought about something positive. Nothing is the same. But the ever-changing reality of ordinary consciousness has been explained as pleasure being the interval between two pains, and pain being the interval between two pleasures. Because it just keeps rolling along, doesn't it? And we use the word attachment and non-attachment, all of our pain, if we really look at it closely, comes from the fact that we want it not to change, isn't it? Just one way or another, something new is presented to us and we don't like it. Or we like it, and then it goes away and we don't like it, and it goes on and on and on. Ever existing, ever conscious, but ever new bliss. And there's this part of that has only recently been coming to mind. It was brought to my attention first when I read a letter that Master wrote to his disciple Rajasi, and Rajasi was always in a state of samadhi. And Master was giving him suggestions about different things he could do while he was in samadhi, different ways he could experience the ever new bliss. It's just like, I didn't know where to go with that. Is it like go to the amusement park for a while, and then you go look at the scenery, and then you enjoy other people, but it's ever new, and you're always conscious. These are just ideas that you just go, at least I go, wow. Wow, this world is not what it seems. But it's also telling me exactly what I knew when I was 2 years old, when I lay down in the back seat of that car. No matter what is happening, if I can find a way to go deep enough into myself, I will discover a reality that is not touched. And even more, that is ever new in its bliss. Even as a child, thank you, God, I had a light center of gravity, as we call it in Education for Life. So when I came to rest, I didn't sink. I bobbed at least a little above the surface. So if I could when I was pulled down, my natural point was up. That's the product of many years, many lifetimes of struggle. That's how we get there, but not perfectly by any means. But nonetheless, I tend to bob about here. I don't stand on top of the water, but I bob about here, so it's not too bad. That's enough. It's enough. I'm not complaining. But the other part of this is how the line that Master says when he talks about these waves of bliss were bursting over him, and he was watching creation and all of this, and he realized that the center of the empyrean, which you have to look up in the dictionary, I did, and I can't quite remember, but it means the big show, one way or another. It's a nicer word than the big show, but it's a big positive word. The center of it was a point of intuitive perception in my own heart. Wow. Sextillion universes are forming and unforming. Galaxies are being made. Light years are passing. All of this is happening. And the center of the entire experience is my intuition, and pointing to the heart. Now, it's not this physical heart that beats, but it's the heart chakra. That part, that energy center in ourselves, which defines our individuality, which determines even more profoundly whether our energy goes up into enlightenment or goes down into further delusion. The heart is the point at which that decision is made. And the heart is the definition of center everywhere. Because every living creature, even every cell, Master said, has that center point of intuitive perception. There's one of Master's marvelous affirmations for health talks about the tiny mouths of the tiny cells just sort of gobbling up the light. When my friend Paula was dealing with one of the rounds of cancer that eventually took her life, she was very childlike in her spirit, in the highest, most spiritual sense. And she just loved to visualize the tiny mouths of her individual cells
sort of gobbling up the light energy, just like that. With conscious awareness, Master guides us in our healing, in our efforts to heal ourselves and others, to try to inspire and awaken the innate intelligence of every individual cell in our body and get it aligned with the light force instead of whatever confusion has led it to align itself with a destructive rather than an uplifting force. Everything, including us, it all emanates from the heart. And then Jesus says, to those who are pure in heart, those who are pure in heart will see God. So that where purity ends up being like, what is purity? What are we really talking about? Well, some theologies will tell us that we're inherently sinners and the only thing that will save us is the sacrifice, usually of Lord Jesus Christ on the altar. And it's not untrue. The theology has gotten a little distorted, but what they're really talking about is the grace of God through the Guru will liberate you from all delusion. I can't defend the whole theology, but the essential impulse was true. Those disciples of Jesus knew that he was the messenger, and through the power that he would share with them, they would be able to find that ray and rise on it. Autobiography of a Yogi, the whole story is discipleship, just from start to finish. This whole episode that I'm talking about is Master standing in front of his Guru and his Guru touching him on the chest, and all of a sudden there's this vision. We don't liberate ourselves. We can't just talk ourselves into being free, because the very thing that's trying to talk ourselves into doing it is the very thing that keeps us lost. This delusion of separateness, this identification with the body, and then all the myriad conditions that result because of that identification. It's fascinating just to realize every time we begin to suffer how much of that suffering, physical, mental, or spiritual, starts from the identification of the self as this limited self. If I am as much in everyone else as I am in this body as Master was, Master walking with Swamiji, stumbling and saying, I forget I am so much in all bodies, I forget which one I'm supposed to keep going. Now that is not a problem I have ever had. Master said, I have to ask people whether or not I've eaten. I tend to remember. Because I'm just instinctively and deeply identified. But this is not real. The entire cosmic creation emanates from an intuitive perception in our own hearts. And purity of heart is simply to be who we really are. To not forget. There's a wonderful Sanskrit word called smriti, which means divine remembrance. And it matches perfectly the word self-realization. Master very carefully, when he first came to America, he used the phrase Yogoda Satsanga, which was still the name of his work in India. But he gradually realized that offering Americans where all this was so foreign in the 1920s and the 30s and the 40s, it was just exceedingly counterproductive. So he found an already existent, he didn't create it, but he adopted for the name of his work an already existent English phrase, self-realization. Now self immediately turns it back toward us. We don't even call it God realization, although that could be considered a synonym, but it's self. It's like the temple is me. The center of the Empyrean is me, but not me as I usually mean that. And that's the whole misunderstanding in the Bible is the pronoun I. To whom or what was Jesus referring when he said I? One body born of Mary dying on the cross, or I, the infinite consciousness? What is self? I can look back and see when I was 2 years old, when I was 13 years old. I'm essentially the same as I am now at the age of 71 and a half. There is a consistency there that is certainly not my body. Fortunately, it's not my mind. It's not my attitudes. It's not my way of life. None of it. But it's there. Because the self is never born and the self never dies. It is always existent. It just moves in and out of these different realities. And so when he called it self-realization, he's looking at all of us and he's asking what is a classic question in yoga practice. Who am I? Really, who am I? And then we don't acquire. We simply realize. We realize who we are. And that's the end of the story, is when we realize who we are. Ramakrishna said to Vivekananda, you know, the keys. Ramakrishna was the guru of Vivekananda. Vivekananda was the foremost disciple, or the most prominent disciple, publicly prominent. Ramakrishna gave Vivekananda an experience of who he was, so to speak, and then Ramakrishna took the key, and I believe it was even in vision, and put it in his pocket. And he said to Vivekananda, you know, I'll give it back to you at the right time. But in the meantime, you have a lot to do. Swami Kriyananda said the same of himself. That Master told him he was free, but that he had a lot of work to do first. And it wouldn't be, as Master said, until the end of your life that it's going to come. So what does that mean in practical terms? I don't know what that really means. But it does mean that the center of the Empyrean emanates from a point of intuitive perception in our own hearts. And purity of heart is not to suddenly become really good at everything and finally never have a misstep or never have a wrong word or never have a sleepless night or never worry. It means to just understand that all of that is not me. To be that 2-year-old person who just lies on the floor of the car and listens to the Om through the tires and says, yes, I know, I'm going to have to get up and get along with my brother and be nice to my mother. You know, there's no escaping any of this. And 13 years old, I'm going to have to sort this all out. This is not working. I'm really going to have to deal with all of this. But never with some tiny part of ourselves that gradually just grows until it takes over everything. We understand that Satchidananda, that's who I am. All-pervasive bliss, ever-new bliss. And however many days and nights of other experience it takes, that can never be taken away from us. And the power of it will draw us back again and again until it becomes our only reality. God bless you.
When the cherries bloom, Loto sings all day long, rising melodies to the sun. Blossoms awake to the gladness of song. See them smile and greet everyone. When the cherries bloom, Kyoto sings all day long, rising melodies to the sun. Blossoms awake to the gladness of song. See them smile and greet everyone. Tell me, little sisters, what have you to say? Live your life as perfectly as this perfect day. Tell me, little sisters, what have you to say? and